Hi, I'm Linda Amran Cooper. Can I just check, are you controlling the slides for us?
If you'd like me to, I can.
Oh, that would be great. Yes, thanks. So if you might pop to the next slide, that would be really helpful. Thank you. It's myself and Martin here today. Claire was helping us submit this. So very nice to see everybody, and I know it's been a very interesting session that we've just had, and also an interesting conference so far. Very, very timely. So I work within the University of London, and I head up our Centre for Distance Education. And my colleague Martin, who works within CoSector, we're both here presenting today. Next slide, please. So just to give you a little bit of background and context, the University of London has about 180,000 students altogether across the Federation member institutions. And within the University of London, what we call worldwide, we have distance learning students. So there's about 48 to 50,000 distance learning students studying in 190 countries around the world. When we got to March last year, 35,000 of those were registered for exams, pen and paper exams that they would have taken in one of our 600 local exam centres. So they go to their local exam centre normally for their examination. So as we went into lockdown, we were faced with 35,000 students who were booked to take about 110,000 paper-based exams across 23 time zones, while we were all sort of working in our spare bedrooms or on the kitchen table, and of course our students were as well. So it was a bit of an effort, and what we want to talk about today is some of the experience of that and how it worked for the students and ourselves. And then also focus in particularly on one aspect of the work that we did that I think colleagues may be interested in. Next slide, please. So just to talk very briefly about the categories of assessment that we chose. So we had basically three types of examination that happened. So all of those 105,000 exams moved online, and they moved into three broad categories. Proctored exams, and that's what we're going to talk about a little bit more with the Janison platform through CoSector. Also limited time unseen traditional type exams lasting between 1 and 3 hours, up to 24 hours, and then open book longer assessments that were open for several days or up to a week. So those were broadly the three categories. We do have a very large number of programs, a large number of modules, so inevitably there was quite a lot of variety in the sort of type of exam that we had. Next slide, please. Oh, that's the picture. You know it, we know it, but of course, because our students were in all of these locations dealing with COVID themselves, with the impact of COVID on their personal lives, on their opportunity to study, it was quite a challenge. Because the students are all distance learning students, most of them attending local teaching centres, they did have access, of course, to our virtual learning environment, and to join the University of London distance programmes, they do have to have a computer and some broadband. That's a sort of entry requirement to come onto the programme because they are distance learning students working on our virtual learning environments. So there was a certain level of digital facility for our students because they have to have that normally anyway. So in fact, their learning was not very much significantly impacted in the online learning environment, but of course the digital assessment was completely different to the pen and paper. Next slide, please. So we undertook a large evaluation of what happened, what happened for those 35,000 students in those 110 exams. And we drew together 4 areas that you'll see here. So the first one is student behaviours, and this was quite interesting. This was looking at how did students engage with the assessment? If they had a 24-hour window, when did they log into the VLE to get access to their exam? When did they submit their exam after they'd had that? Did they make full use of the 24-hour window, for example? That was just one example. And in fact, what we found is that some students didn't. So what we learned from that is that students need preparation in order to engage with these type of different platform experiences. We looked at student experience and we undertook a large-scale survey and we gathered data on also through interviews with students as well and with programme directors. We looked at student outcomes and we haven't finished that work completely yet, but that's looking at basically the average mark in comparison to the last 3 years on a particular module to see whether there were significant shifts positively or negatively. And we looked at organisational issues, logistical issues. We talked to the examiners who were marking the assessments, who set the assessments and so on. We talked to the logistical teams. We gathered a lot of information there. Next slide, please. So this is just a short insight into some of the responses that we got back from the student experience survey. So we got about a 30% response rate for the students who were involved in the online assessment, about 35,000. And what you can see here is them answering some of the questions about the experience. A couple of them that are worth sort of particularly filling in on was the first one, which was I was able to demonstrate my learning through the online assessment. And you can see the vast majority of them felt that they were able to demonstrate their learning through the online assessment, which is, of course, very, very important. What we also know is that 93% of our students did undertake the online assessment. And that's actually a higher rate than we normally have with our traditional model of pen and paper exams in the 600 exam centres local to the students. So there was a higher level of engagement and students felt that they were able to demonstrate their learning. And indeed, from the marking that we've done, they were able to demonstrate their learning. Then there were some questions about the use of the platform, and you can see that we're relatively high scores here in terms of accessing the platform, being able to upload their work and so on. There was a lower score for the proctoring, and we are going to talk about the invigilation arrangements a bit later on because that's worth exploring, I think. So that's just a sort of snapshot of some of the data that we got back from students. One of the things, of course, that we've been worried about, because we were all experiencing this ourselves and continue to, was the question of whether they were going to be able to take their assessment in a suitable environment. You know, were students sort of stuck in small areas of accommodation, perhaps with family members with them? Was it going to be a challenge? The vast majority, 82%, said that they were able to take their assessment in a suitable environment, which was very encouraging and reassuring for us. Next slide, please. In this question, we also in the survey asked students to think about the future and what they would like to see. You know, picking up on some of the discussions that we've had today across the sessions, I'm sure that we'll see. So what we found is that 66% of our students would like online assessment to continue. That was slightly stronger for older students, which was interesting, rather than our younger students. So students who were 25 plus were more enthusiastic about online assessment continuing. It did differ between courses, so postgraduate students were more likely, and independent students who didn't attend teaching centres, again, were more likely to want this to continue. Sorry, I'm having to read from another screen here. Students from countries, as we might expect, with more digital capacity were more open to online assessment going forward. But there was also a strong correlation to some of the questions we asked about feeling well prepared to use online assessment platform and being able to demonstrate their learning. So those were strongly correlated to an agreement. So if students felt well prepared, and if they felt they were able to demonstrate their learning, then they were likely to agree that they would like to see digital assessment continuing. So again, I think this ties back to some of the thoughts that we'll all be having about preparing students. So to sort of summarise then, the impact on the students, but 93% of them took exams, which is favourable compared with previous years. Importantly for us, students in all locations engaged with exams. So every place where we had students, we saw students being able to engage with their exams. The vast majority felt that they were able to demonstrate their learning through the online assessment. Some students were not fully equipped to engage with the format or the requirements, so there are implications for training, and there was room for enhanced communication. You know, there were times when we were perhaps a bit slow in giving a clear outline, and then occasionally we could have been a bit clearer in our instructions. Not at all surprising given the scale and the range, etc., but a lot of learning to be done from this. Next slide, please. So I'm going to hand over to Martin now, who's going to focus in on the digital proctoring. Thanks, Martin.
Thank you, Linda. First of all, just want to, in a sense, just introduce myself in the context of my name is Martin Wills. I work for CoSector, which is part of the University of London, so very much work hand in hand with Linda and her team and other colleagues in the worldwide team. Just before I sort of jump on to take you through a story and a journey that we experienced across the summer in terms of our proctoring exams, I just want to take us back slightly to the point that Linda was making earlier in terms of the assessment categories a little bit earlier, is that through CoSector we also supported the limited time and unseen and the open book through supporting the Moodle platform alongside worldwide colleagues, and that's something that we do for institutions up and down the country. So there's a little bit of a backdrop to that. I'll explain a little bit more. But today, really just wanted to focus on, as we said, the experience of our proctoring. So the situation which Linda's explained is obviously in a very short space of time, we needed to mobilise a project that I think in normal circumstances we'd probably do in around about a year, and we had literally 8 weeks to mobilise proctoring against a set of law students. Now, just before we jump into that, I'll explain a little bit in terms of proctoring invigilation and the differences between setting an exam striking the obvious, but there are differences that need to be understood and differences that need to be contextualised. And the first thing is, first of all, in terms of digital proctoring, there is obviously a process to actually validate and prove who the individual is. Which is very much a digital process, facial recognition software actually identifying. But more fundamentally, in a way, digital proctoring very much looks at what I describe as it's an after the event, where you're taking video recordings, you're taking screen monitorings, which are then recorded, and then they're available for after the event for review. So that's the first key point. The second key point is when you're looking at proctoring, they very much need to work hand in hand with the question answering software. Now, the reason for doing that is if you've ever looked at proctoring solutions or software, there's a huge amount of configuration that goes with that. So there needs to be alignment in how the two systems potentially are configured. And the closer and more linked the two systems are, the better. The final point I really probably want to draw out on this particular piece is also the digital question answering systems are very much driven along the lines of question banks, and it's how you leverage the power of the question banks is also an opportunity as much as a challenge in this. If we just move on to the next slide. not really wanting to take you through the detail of the timeline, but it's really for just making the point that we had 8 weeks to mobilise from virtually the. I absolutely recall this in terms of the bank holiday weekend in May, to then somebody saying we're running exams at the beginning of July. Now, as Linda said, this is against a backdrop of all the internal staff mobilising, moving into working, setting up their kitchen tables, and the challenges that brought in the period. There's the uncertainty of what is actually going on in the context of both internationally and in the UK. Lockdowns, what does that mean? What can you do? What can you not do? And then behind that is also the students' perspective, because they're dealing with the same level of anxieties that arguably our staff are. Is what am I going to do? How am I going to do it? Health issues that are going alongside that. Then in terms of how do we actually set up and mobilise a project, and I'll go through some of the key lessons behind this, which are usually quite obvious, which I'm sure you'll appreciate. But even just initiating a project in a university environment is never quite that straightforward. Procurement processes, digital processes, GDPR processes, all having to take place in a very, very quick timetable. Then moving into, in a way, delivery, authoring exams. Then even though you've got exam papers actually authored, they're not authored in a digital context. And how does that then loop into marking processes as well? As I say, I wouldn't like to take you through the detail, but I look at that slide and just it sort of scares me, the amount of work that went on, the amount of hours that went on, and the conditions that the students were working in, and the conditions that staff were working in this context. So I'm really just going to jump straight into, in a way, summarising more of the lessons behind this. If we can just move to the next slide. So quite obvious in many respects is, first of all, rethink your assessments, and this is more a forward-looking perspective. So rethink your assessments, the exam process, rethink in terms of what the digital assessment is. It's not just taking your existing exam process and trying to actually digitize it. You need to rethink it and actually fundamentally re-engineer it, because it won't work just trying to digitize an exam paper process. And arguably that was one of the things that we were trying to do in our mini project, was literally trying to just digitize an existing paper process. But we tripped across so many things, whether it was actually setting up the questions, the marking processes. So you've got to go back a little bit to a blank piece of process paper to actually re-engineer and starting thinking it right from end to end. Quite an obvious one in many respects. We had 8 weeks to do this, but if as I said at the beginning, normally we were probably planning this out in a year-long process. So start the process early, put all the basics in place. Think about what regulations that you actually need to update, the privacy statements, the GDPR diligence that goes in behind this. I'd probably make a statement also around, in a way, around the GDPR compliance as well. Is we're having a conversation with one of the legal team from one of an institution we're doing work with at the moment. Is now the technology behind digital assessment and the technology behind AI, biometrics is only going to get more and more sophisticated. So in terms of putting your statements together, your privacy statements, your GDPR statements, it's not about actually being very precise about the technology, but it is about actually building in and factoring in that the technology will continue to learn and develop behind that. The next one is pretty obvious as well, is engage your students and stakeholders. Communicate, 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 very obvious. You've got to take both students and stakeholders on a change journey, on a transformation journey. You've got to educate your students into how to actually take exams and get the best out of them in a digital context. It's the same with stakeholders right across the piece, internal stakeholders from your legal teams to your academics in terms of the markers. There's a lot of stakeholders involved in actually working through this, and we tripped across a lot of these often at the last minute, and had to backtrack to work our way through them. I think also, our experiences were, when communicating with anybody, whether it be students or staff or whoever, don't expect them all to actually follow basic instructions. We got this down effectively down to following 6 basic instructions. 90% of the time, 90% of followed the instructions, but there was always 10% that, for one reason or another, didn't seem to be able to actually follow those instructions. Now, those of you that have worked in communication, obviously, there are various means of communicating, and people interpret information in different contexts. The next point is, okay, this is a new system. We have reasonably tech-savvy students, and they like to break and challenge systems. Ideally, give them the opportunity to actually play with the system, set up play pits to enable them to actually get used and oriented to the system, but don't necessarily allow them to break the system in the context of an exam that's actually really crucial to them. And then fundamentally, the approach on behind this is, think about it that you've actually got to train your students. You've actually got to train them into using the system like you would train anybody else using a system. You just move on to the next one. Sorry, can I get you to move to the next slide? Thank you. This relates back into the first point as well, is this is a new way of working. This is a new way of working for the student. It's a new way of working for the academic team. It's a new way of working for the support teams behind this. There are new business processes. New business processes need to be set up. So, your organisation needs to factor in how you would go through validating proctoring processes, how you would actually utilise the after event, the proctoring videos and screenshots, how you would actually deal with violations that have come up against those proctoring. Support is completely different in this context. It's very different to having students in examination centres where you've actually got physically people on hand walking around, not just invigilating but also supporting. It's the same type of activity, but you have to think about it very differently. The other key challenge is fundamentally you've got everybody rushing through the door at the same time. So when an exam starts, there's a huge amount of activity happening in a very short space of time. And in the context of the worldwide one, we had 3,000 people, 3,000 students taking an exam. Now, that became challenging because as the sun was falling around the earth, east to west, those students who were coming online, and we had different openings for the different time zones. But we would end up with 300-400 people trying to rush into an exam, and we needed to make sure we scaled up support for those students at those particular moments in time, which is very challenging, but it's one that needs to be recognised. Behind this is the process for exams goes right from setting questions, how you set the questions, but also how you mark the questions. So you need to work through training of staff all the way through, including marking papers and training the academics behind that are marking as well. Now, fundamentally behind all this is a whole set of technical requirements and technical needs. But before you have to hit any technical needs, the first thing is data. The integrity of your data, your student data. We tripped across the challenges of changes of data at the last minute. Now you have to factor that into this. Data does change, so how do you actually do that? But one of the key advantages of digital examinations is you're going to have a huge amount of digital data. So it gives you a lot of data at your fingertips in terms of dashboards, reporting and analytics, and potentially too much in the first instance. but it has got a lot of richness of data sitting behind this. I think this was covered in the previous presentation, which is a very valid point, is some of the challenges that we had, particularly in the worldwide context, is we had students all over the world, particularly large cohorts in Pakistan, Bangladesh. Now, they were using their own computer technology. They were using their own broadband. So you're at the mercy of what broadband speeds they've got, what reliability, what the latency is behind that. And with any system, as you will all know, there are minimum specifications that you need to operate certain systems. One of the reasons that the Janison system was chosen, because it has an offline capability. So a student can actually continue to do the exam, and then it uploads it when the broadband actually comes back online, if it does happen to go down, which was really a key thing and a key need that was actually needed behind this. But it is something to recognise and work with, to understand, well, there are minimum requirements to make any system operate, particularly combining both the broadband and the specifications of devices as well. I appreciate that we've whistle-stopped through this, and this is really very much the highlights of what our experiences were, and it's certainly a foundation for the University of London and worldwide to move forward into future digital examinations. And the world of COVID in many ways has not gone away. It's just changing that landscape. So as I say, this is a whistle-stop tour. I'd like to thank Linda for her slides at the beginning. I think we've probably literally got 1 or 2 minutes for questions, but would invite questions.
So there's just a couple of questions. One is around, was there any assessment framework that you used to help shape the way the academics reconceptualized their assessment?
Yeah, I mean, thank you. So it's a really, really good question, and the answer is sort of yes and sort of no, because as Martin pointed out, we had about 8 weeks to kind of move things forward, really. So, and of course the exams had already been set, so the examinations had been written for a paper-based environment. So some of the academic teams were able to make some changes to their assessment. In some cases, it was just about taking out a few questions to make the less of a demand on the students. In other cases, it was to change the format quite substantially, but it varied quite a lot between different programs in terms of what was viable. It is worth saying that we have, for our larger programs, we have zonal papers, in that there are several different zones of papers, because we've got students taking the same module across the world. There might be 4,000 or 5,000 people registered on the same module. So in terms of making sure that the assessment is secure, in the old-fashioned paper-based assessments, we have zonal papers that are different papers released in different areas. So we were able to utilise that. Going forward, there's a lot of discussion now and a lot of work going on with the programme teams to identify appropriate types of examinations for the digital format. And you know, that point about the assessment for a digital platform is not necessarily the same as a pen and paper exam, I think, is a really important one. I did put the link in the side to the 2 assessment toolkits that the University of London has. Those have been developed over a number of years, and there was quite a lot of resource on the Centre for Distance Education website as well that was used to support the teams. I think there was another question, was there?
There was around the minimum technical specifications, and so Martin has responded to that they were shared with students. Absolutely.
So a couple of things on that. So coming into, when a student applies for the programme, they are given the minimum computer requirements at the point of application. So when they come into a University of London distance education program, it's specified what they need. So they have to have kit to start the program, understandably, because we work in a virtual learning environment all the time. In terms of the proctored exams, they needed a camera, which was not necessarily what they had. They may have had a laptop or a tablet or a computer that didn't have a camera. So a lot of students had to go out and buy cameras, and we were able to help sort of find some resources and some sources of cameras in different locations. But yes, they were given the details there. Martin, did you want to add to that? Martin, we're not hearing you. I'm not sure if you're coming back in.
I might just.
Yeah, I mean, we had key around that.
We are going into the lunchtime meetup now, so if anyone has
On
any
one hand,
additional
is,
questions for the presenters, please feel free to stay. For
being,
everyone who does want to go and have a break, thank you very much for joining us today, and please join me in thanking the presenters for sharing their wonderful
I'm talking, but nothing.
experiences with digital resources around practice across the sector and how we can use digital exams effectively.
Thank you very much, colleagues, for the opportunity to speak here, and to the other presenters. Great conference.
I'm sorry, Martin. I think one of us has quite a delay on theirs. I'm sorry for speaking over you then.